Thank you all for coming to the New America Foundation. I'm Jeffrey Lewis. I'm the director of the Nuclear Strategy and Nonproliferation Initiative. Generally, as the name suggests, we deal with nuclear weapons. So today we have something a little bit different. And in partnership with Global Green USA and Physicians for Social Responsibility, we're hosting Piers Millett, who is in town from Geneva. For those of you who don't know, Piers is one of only 3 people who work at the Biological Weapons Convention Implementation Support Unit, which is sort of the closest thing to a treaty organization for the Biological Weapons Convention. Although it's a vitally important task, I was informed that the budget is less than $300,000 a year.
Something in that picture there.
It's an instance of tremendous mismatch, I think, in resources and importance. I'm just going to say a few words about why I think the topic is particularly important, and then we're going to turn it to Piers to talk about his experiences in Geneva, and then my friend Paul Walker, from the director of the Security and Sustainability Program at Global Green USA, the U.S. affiliate of Green Cross International.
It is, yep.
Is going to provide a little bit of commentary. The reason that a nuclear program is having a meeting on biological weapons is twofold. One is Piers is a friend, and it's an excuse to have you all over for a wine reception. But more importantly, I'm an arms control advocate, and I think it is extremely important in this era we live in to change the nature of our security policies and move from a situation where we are focused on deterrence and confrontation to cooperation, because the threats we face today really aren't of the sort we thought we faced during the Cold War. And I think that's true in nuclear weapons, where so much of the focus that we spend on deterrence is misplaced, because what we really need to be doing is cooperating with Russia and China to control fissile material. And I think it's especially true in the field of biological weapons and just generally research. From my perspective, biological weapons are not going to kill nearly as many people as infectious diseases. And as somebody who has a strong interest in China, it astounds me that the United States does very little cooperation with, for example, the institution in Beijing that is most responsible for SARS research, in part because they're listed in our State Department compliance reports, or at least old ones, as being part of the biological weapons program. And so, from my perspective, we really are on the cusp of an era in which the urgent task for us, I think, as a community, is to set aside this legacy of the Cold War and confrontation and really build the structures that allow us to cooperate and address the threats we face today. And so, as a modest step in that direction, I give you our friend Piers.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honour to be able to speak to you today, and I'd like to thank both the New America Foundation and Global Green for giving me this opportunity. That having been said, I will get on with my comments and start by telling you a little bit about myself. I trained originally as a microbiologist, so a scientist by training. From there, I jumped ship and launched into looking at international relations, because it's far more interesting and you're entitled to have your own opinion, and you're allowed to be a bit more vocal on that. That got me caught up with the BWC Secretariat, where I've been since 2001, and now I'm increasingly trying to get back to scientific roots and get involved with some of the cutting-edge biological research and looking at the implications that might have for security. Biological Weapons Convention. I don't know how many people in the room are particularly familiar with it, but when it was created as a traditional Cold War arms control instrument. The final text that was eventually to become the convention was tabled coincidentally on the same day by both the US and the Soviet Union as it was at that time. It basically, in line with the other WMD control regimes, tries to balance some degree of security with some guarantees to be able to pursue peaceful use in the biological sciences. But where I think it differs quite considerably to chemical and nuclear regimes is that there are no possessor states. Certainly none that I'm aware of have ever declared weapons that they've had to destroy as part of the treaty regime, like you would have with chemical weapons. And there's certainly we don't suffer from any of our member states being able to retain biological weapons under the convention. I guess the other really big difference is that there's no verification or compliance regime. There's no inspectorate, there's no international organisation, as we've heard, there's no mechanism there to guarantee, if you like, centralised control, police biology. The other thing I think it's probably worth pointing out is that, at least in my opinion, out of the sciences, biology is perhaps the most dual use, in so much as the technology involved is pretty much exactly the same for permitted peaceful uses as for prohibited weapons purposes. It makes it very difficult to differentiate between what's allowed and what's not allowed, at least remotely and very easily. And that obviously ties into how do you police, how do you verify the convention. It also has a pretty huge scope. It doesn't just cover diseases related to humans, covers animals and plants as well, and also deals really with warfare, as in activities of states to make weapons, covers terrorism through requirements for states to take national implementation legislation, and that really, because it drills down on the concept of using biology as a weapon, also really includes everything down to crimes and assassination attempts, so it's really quite large in scope. And I personally I see it as a big challenge for the future because of the scale of biology. You're talking about phenomenal number of facilities around the world, expanding geographic distribution, increasing all the time, and so the problems involved with actually dealing with it are going to get even worse. A little bit on the ISU. We're a new unit, as you said, only 3 people. We have a mandate, depending on how you look at it, that's quite limited or very broad. Depends how you interpret it.
Open to interpretation.
Yes. But it's really, I mean, the clue's in the title. It's there to support the process. We like to be able to say that means we help states help themselves. We're not there to perform the functions of an international organisation. It's really there to let everybody else do the work and let us take the credit. So that's a good system. It's win-win. Will win for us anyway. But I think it's also worth pointing out the inverse relationship. You were hinting at this between the regimes. If you talk very approximate numbers, I think the IAEA deals with around about 1,000 facilities. Has a staff of, last time I saw any official figures, about 3,500 people, if you include everybody that works for the IAEA to deal with that. Mm-hmm. Chemical weapons, OPCW, last figures I saw, about 10,000 facilities declared if you include the organic chemical facilities. They have about 300 people to do with that. Biological weapons, you can go up another order or 2 of magnitude and you're down to 3 there. So we like to claim to be the most efficient international setup. It's a great place to work. I really enjoy it. I think one of the advantages of it being a small team and not necessarily being so institutionalized as a large organisation is that we get to really hop around. I get to come and do this today, and I'll go back and do background papers, and I'll serve on the secretariat of a meeting. It's a new thing every time, so it's personally a rewarding thing. Current work programme, because there isn't an international intergovernmental organisation, the BWC has taken, I think, probably a little bit of a different approach to the other international treaty regimes. There's a real, at least in my sense, I have a sense that there's a real drive towards building a community there, about bringing people in, about trying to get all this broader collection of stakeholders on board, because there's no centralised organisation to do the work. The work's got to be done by others, and as I say, they can do the work and we can take the credit. So what else did I want to say on that? I think it's also noticeable over the last 10 years that there's a real movement away from the traditional Cold War arms issues here of the developed world and the developing world. I think that's twofold. Firstly, that there is a convergence on concepts of health security, where all countries recognise that that diseases, irrespective of cause, pose a collective problem and that it's going to require a collaborative solution. Secondly, I think that biology, the way that biology is spreading around the world, is no longer about the developed world and the developing world. If you look at the figures that OECD put out on the biotechnology progress, the fastest growing areas are all in the developing world. So it's not really about developed versus developing or rich versus poor. It's about biotechnological haves and biotechnological have-nots, and that's a very different boundary, which is creating a very different dynamic in the meetings. I think the last sort of area that I'll focus on, and then maybe we move on, is it's worth flagging that in a couple of years' time we will have our next review conference. I know amongst the community that focuses on nuclear weapons, there's a slightly important event coming up next year, but there is another one coming up the year after. And I'm hoping that through actions today and perhaps other bits and pieces that we can persuade some of you that are interested in these sort of issues to once you get through your important work next year, to focus on some of the biological stuff. I see this next review conference as a critical one in the juncture of the BWC, that as you're probably aware, the atmosphere 10 years ago was a little bit strained after efforts to develop a verification protocol weren't concluded. And we've gone through what I see as a consolidation process, where as opposed to trying to force states to come together and agree on new things, we've gone through a process of looking through these common understandings and annual meetings at what states already agree upon. And that, I think, is a very firm foundation to look forward to where we might go next. And I think that there's a real opportunity here to think about how you do arms control, disarmament, non-proliferation in the 21st century with what is virtually a blank slate. You know, it's a really good opportunity to try out new ideas, to see what we could do given, basically blue sky thinking. I'm quite happy to go into any more of that in more detail.
That's perfect.
Great, thank you, Jeff, and thank you very much, Piers, too, for coming to Washington, to the center of power, right, to talk about BWC. As you know, we've done a lot of work over the years in Global Green USA and Green Cross International under what we've in the past called Legacy of the Cold War program. We now call Security and Sustainability, but our purpose has really been to try to advocate and facilitate and implement arms control and disarmament agreements, and particularly under the auspices of the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program here in the United States and the G8 Global Partnership, to try to actually physically get rid of weapon systems and stockpiles that are dangerous and subject to diversion and proliferation safely and soundly, implementing full protection of public health and the environment. So, as many of you know, I think in the audience, we've worked probably close to 15 years now, very closely with the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. State Department, the Russian Foreign Ministry, the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Industry, which has responsibility for chemical weapons destruction over the years. And we've also worked actually very closely with the international multilateral regimes, Biological Weapons Convention, Chemical Weapons Convention, and the IAEA, NPT, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization. I'm glad we're talking about the BWC today, because this is, I mentioned to Piers over lunch, it really is an issue that, goes below the radar screen all the time. Chemical Weapons Convention does to a large extent too, and of course with the recent Obama-Medvedev summit yesterday, thank goodness attention is being brought to non-proliferation, but primarily nuclear weapons. Even though many of us, I think, in the field believe that the most likely terrorist use or accidental occasion amongst weapons of mass destruction would probably be chemical or biological. So I think it's a long time that we focus attention on this. And all three treaties, Non-Proliferation Treaty, CWC, and BWC are all having their 5-year reviews in 2010, 11, and 12. And those are for a variety of different reasons, very important occasions that I think all of us should pay attention to. Let me make about 4 points, and I think they complement what you've said, Piers, broadly about biological pathogens and weapons and threats, and see if I'm going to skip through this because I obviously have too much here for 10 minutes or so. I really don't want to take more than that time. But first point I want to make is that the threat of disease outbreaks, biological accidents, and bioterrorism are very real. We shouldn't overlook that fact and forget about it when we keep talking about efforts of reducing nuclear weapons and the like. Over 3/4 of the world's nations have now joined the 1972 Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, what we usually call the BWC, banning the use of biological pathogens as weapons. However, biothreats still exist in several potential and serious forms. Naturally occurring diseases, which you've mentioned, Piers, illicit secret state weapons programs, including possibly those described as defensive military research efforts, intentional use by non-state actors and terror organizations, and biotechnology lab accidents. And let me mention a couple of examples so this brings it sort of real to everybody. Several examples over the past decade of disease outbreaks point clearly to the dangers faced by the world community. The outbreaks recently of Ebola virus, avian bird flu, SARS, and most recently, of course, swine or H1N1 flu all illustrate, in my mind, the ongoing threat of naturally occurring illnesses. The World Health Organization has documented the outbreak, for example, of 19 or more infectious diseases, some highly resistant to drug treatment, at over 100 sites throughout the globe over the past decade. So this is real. And this is very real, and it seems anyway, increasingly so. Terrorist threats have also been found to be real. The as yet unsolved anthrax attacks, contrary to what some people would argue, I guess in the United States in 2001, killed 5 people, injured another 17, but impacted U.S. government operations and general security concerns in a major way. The non-lethal food poisoning attacks by the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh sect in the U.S. in 1984. Some of you in the audience may remember that. I do. And the unsuccessful efforts by the Japanese terrorist group Aum Shinrikyo. We always talk about having used nerve agents, but they also used anthrax in 1993 while they were testing the use of nerve agents as well. I think all emphasize the importance of this. And finally, I'd say the Al-Qaeda terrorist organization has specifically stated publicly it is seeking weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological. And recent reports indicate that it may be specifically researching biological pathogens for use as terror weapons. So secondly, let me say response mechanisms to biothreats are also extremely important. And that's where the BWC and implementation of the BWC comes in. Namely, I would call disease surveillance and epidemic intelligence. In light of the seriousness of biothreats today, the importance of global disease surveillance, coordinated public health communication and response mechanisms, and international legal prohibitions against biological weapons needs to be emphasized. Some of you may know Masood Khan, who was the past president of the last 5-year review of the BWC, who we had keynote at one of our roundtable discussions we had in Geneva a few years ago. He stated, for example, he's warned that almost any agent can be applied for maligned purposes, complicating determination of offensive versus defensive military research and benign versus malicious product development. Khan has also emphasized addressing biosecurity and biosafety issues is an imperative, not a matter of choice today. Those are direct quotes from him. He's emphasized, let me mention 5 issues amongst many others, but I thought these are important. One is the scope and notification and response to disease outbreaks, now requiring notification of 4 additional diseases: smallpox, polio, new human influenza subtypes, and SARS. Secondly, national obligations to establish core capabilities to detect and respond to disease outbreaks. 3, the National Centers for Efficient Communication, and we should talk about, I think, identification and communication issues, Piers, a bit more. Recommended measures for response, and external advice regarding actions under the international health regulations, which have recently been updated, thank goodness, in the last couple of years. So on the BWC, my third point is that the BWC is a very important treaty and needs to be expanded. It's attracted over 150 states, parties. What is it now, 155, 156?
160, at least 3, if not slightly
163, okay.
Yeah.
So we're getting there, yeah. And although it provides a comprehensive ban on biological weapons and serves as an important legal norm for global security, it lacks teeth, as Piers has said, to verify and implement its mandate. You know, our former President Reagan said, trust but verify. Well, under the BWC, it's basically trust but trust. And that is an ongoing, dilemma for all of us, I think. Most everyone recognizes, on the one hand, the vital importance of the BWC as a long-standing legal mechanism to make the development, production and use of biological weapons taboo in the international community, just like we're trying to do with chemical weapons, and I think as we will eventually get to, if President Obama has his way, with nuclear weapons. On the other hand, we recognize that the Convention does not take state actors fully into account, just like the Chemical Weapons Convention, and that this may be the most important threat in addition to laboratory accidents and naturally occurring disease outbreaks in the 21st century. The BWC does prohibit the transfer of biological agents, toxins, weapons, equipment, and means of delivery to any recipient whatsoever, but does not explicitly refer to the issue of bioterrorism, which was not thought to constitute a threat when the convention was negotiated 37, 40 years ago. So I'll come back to Masood Khan. He did the last 5-year review in 2006, some really, at least 5 major steps he pointed out. He said, 1, we need to universalize the convention. We use the term universality or universalize pretty widely, but in general, I would say it's to press the non-states parties, those that have neither signed nor ratified the treaty. And there's probably, if we're up to 163, there's probably 35 maybe, or 33, something like that, depending on how you define a country. And also press the non-ratified signatory nations to join the BWC in order to make it universal. We need to address recent scientific technological developments in the biotech area in order to help implement a more comprehensive biosecurity regime. It's always the evolution of technology, both in the chemical and the biological fields, and they're actually increasingly interrelated as well. 3, to confront the threat of bioterrorism by addressing the security of biological pathogen collections and research laboratories globally, including international trade. 4, to develop the cooperative synergy amongst states parties and non-governmental organizations, NGOs like ourselves, here, in order to help establish a more effective global network. And 5, to make progress in holding states parties accountable by passing national implementation criteria. My 4th point is really in this whole issue of trying to prevent the proliferation and use of biological pathogens as weapons of mass destruction. We need to strengthen the global partnership and non-proliferation regimes. And we all know that the G8 Global Partnership, founded 7 years ago now, committing to $20 billion in efforts to work with the former Soviet states to reduce proliferation and eliminate weapons of mass destruction, has really primarily focused on nuclear and chemical weapons, not really focused on biological pathogens and issues. That, I think, really needs to change. We also know that the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program here and the Department of Energy nuclear nonproliferation programs focus much more on nuclear and chemical issues as well. Part of that is the problem that the Russians, of course, have not responded terribly well and not provided much transparency and cooperation in their military and biological weapons labs. Neither have we, frankly, in the United States. Let me raise just a couple of concluding remarks if I have time, Jeff. I think these will hopefully be a little bit provocative and raise some questions amongst you all for discussion. First, outbreaks of disease, both naturally occurring and accidental, remain almost a daily occurrence globally. I can give you some numbers here too, but it really is on a daily basis as we sit here, and require timely identification and effective response mechanisms. And you can see with 3 people sitting in Geneva for the Implementation Support Unit, pretty much limits to what extent they can respond to that on a daily regular basis. The threat of terrorist use of biological pathogen or disease as a weapon remains a serious threat, but there remain serious technical hurdles to weaponization of such agents, so it may not be quite the threat that we really, you see in the headlines every now and again. Nevertheless, the speed of identification of a disease outbreak, smallpox, avian flu, Ebola virus, a new strain of human influenza, H1N1, or other deadly viruses, is really critical in defending against the global pandemic. The BWC sets an important global norm against the possession and use of biological weapons by both state and non-state actors, but it needs to be strengthened through more robust participation in the Convention's confidence-building measures, and we can talk about what are called CBMs if you want. The BWC needs to be universalized. There's 30-odd non-state parties need to be encouraged to join the arms control regime, and there has to be a proactive outreach effort to do that. The question is, who's going to do that? Likewise, states parties need to be supported in drafting and passing national implementing legislation. This is a big challenge in the BWC. It also remains a big challenge in the Chemical Weapons Convention. There's less than 50% of the 188 states parties to the CWC, for example, which have passed national implementing legislation. Campaigns for BWC universality and national implementation would be useful, perhaps coordinated by the ISU, the BWC unit in Geneva, in the run-up to the 7th Review Conference about 30 months from now. International, national, and non-governmental organizations need to play key roles in helping implement disease surveillance, identification, and response efforts globally. Threat reduction and non-proliferation projects, be it the U.S. Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, CTR, non-LUGAR, and the G8 Global Partnership, really should coordinate their efforts much better in biothreat reduction with international and national public health agencies, such as the World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control, the American Public Health Association, and the World Congress on Public Health. 2 final points: cooperative and enhanced efforts in biosecurity, protecting pathogen collections with higher security equipment and practices. You've all seen the pictures, probably from Russia and the former Soviet Union, of what I call the bubble gum and string, security efforts in the refrigerators. And in biosafety, developing standard safety measures in research labs so we don't have, the accidents where tularemia, as you know, was infected 3 researchers in Boston University, where the new BSL-4 lab is opening now in Boston, must also play a central role in establishing a global biorisk management system. And last, the 7th BWC Review Conference in 2011, probably usually November, I think, something like that.
November, December.
November, December. Needs to help create a sustainable plan of action for global coverage of disease surveillance and timely response mechanisms. So I'll leave it at that. Jeff.
Great. Well, that's fantastic. We've got a little more than an hour for discussion. And I wanted to start with a question to Piers. In the course of our discussion, the draft verification protocol to the BWC came up. And as a loyal international civil servant, you can't say this, but I will say that was, to me, a shocking abdication of leadership by the Bush administration. It might not have been the perfect verification protocol, but the way in which we just sort of walked away bothered me. So let me ask you, without commenting on whether that was a good or a bad decision, what would that protocol or similar efforts to elaborate on verification mean in your day-to-day work? I mean, how would that change the way that we go about implementing the treaty?
So you're going to start off with an easy question.
Yeah.
You should ask if this is on the record or off the record.
I assume everything's on the record, unless I've been told otherwise.
That little camera ensures.
Right.
Well, what I will say is I actually did a master's in research methodology. My dissertation on that master's in about 2003 was looking at the statistical process for selecting facilities under what was the draft verification protocol. And basically the purpose of the master's dissertation was finding out how easy it was to beat the system. And it would prove to be quite easy to beat the system. I think it's also probably worth pointing out that perhaps the shock of the announcement that the US wouldn't be able to support the verification protocol seems a little bit, in retrospect, not much of a shock. If you go back to the process started originally with a scientific and technological review of whether it's feasible to verify the Biological Weapons Convention. If you go back to the US positions on the end of what was then known as the VEREX process, you get a sense that this is, well, we're not utterly convinced we can actually do this. We're prepared to see what will happen. We're prepared to see what the outcome of this process will be, but we're going into this with a kind of feeling we're not convinced. So I think it's a little unfair to say it was a shock, or even an abdication at that point in time. I also personally think on this that whether or not the reasons for doing it are right, I have sort of 4 questions that I would ask if we were going to try and police biology in that sort of way. Firstly, how many facilities are you going to try and capture? Biology's come a long way since the last time we looked at this in 1997. If you're going to look at any biological facility that could be used to make weapons or weapons agents, you're certainly going to have to start looking at high school biology labs and pretty much everything above it in all countries in the world. Well, all 163 countries in the world. It's a huge number. So even if you can create a system to do that, you then have to find some way to make governments and ultimately civil society comfortable that if you're trying to police biology, that you know what all biologists are doing in their labs all of the time. If you can do that, BWC doesn't just cover human threats, covers animal and plant as well. So what about simply moving an highly infectious animal pathogen from one side of a border to another, starting an outbreak that would cost potentially millions or billions of US dollars in economic loss that really doesn't require a weaponization process or a dedicated production facility? You've got to take that into account once you're verifying the BWC. And finally, if you can do all of that, how much would it cost? And is that the best use of money given the global situation and the natural disease outbreaks we've been hearing about? I think the key in what you said is in how you look at verification. I mean, the word in some ways is the problem. I know that some of the problems and some of the contention when that process finished was, I think, down to different expectations. That from what I can see from having read the official statements, the US was looking for a mechanism that would guarantee that countries are living up to their obligations, that you couldn't cheat on the system. Whilst there were other countries who were basically looking for a transparency mechanism, a confidence-building mechanism, and they weren't so bothered if it was 100% effective or 90% effective. To be honest, I think they would have been happy if it was 30% effective, and they would say that was a step in the right direction. And some of the difficulty, I think, from what I understand, is that competing approach, that this wasn't tabled as a confidence-building protocol or a transparency protocol. It became known as a verification protocol, and that different level of judging might have led to some of the complications.
Well, if you'll permit me the indulgence of a follow-up, because that is precisely what I wanted to draw you out a little bit on, which is we live in this era of unprecedented advances in the life sciences, and it's truly remarkable how quickly that field is changing. And the goal, obviously, is not to stop that. In fact, it's to do the opposite. It's to find a way to put in place measures that make all parties confident so that, as an international community, we can live safely and sort of enjoy the benefits of these dramatic advances. So, what sort of activities could you imagine being feasible along those lines that you don't do now, but that you could do? Not that you would do, because obviously that's for the states' parties, but things that you know that you would have the capacity to do.
Us as the ISU, or options that the BWC might look at?
Anything between you as one of the three members of the ISU or you as a microbiologist who knows a little bit about these issues.
Okay. They both sort of follow on from each other, actually.
I had hoped.
Me as a microbiologist, I think, obviously, I personally think there are limits to policing biology. If you're going to try and provide some oversight mechanism for biology, I think the agents of that oversight have to be biologists. I would say that every single practicing biologist has a duty to make sure that their science is being used for beneficial purposes. They are, in effect, agents of verification. We, as scientists, have that responsibility. So you're really talking about changing the way that biological scientists think about biology, getting over this concept of science being value neutral. I don't believe that science is value neutral. I think you go into science because you want to contribute to beneficial things for humanity. There's a driving force there for the good, and I think that is a value statement. So I think we need to find ways to make scientists more aware of that, and in order to do that, that would therefore provide opportunities to need to engage with those communities increasingly, and I think that's something that events like this one help to do. And it's an important step. The BWC itself has been pulling in biosafety associations, professional societies, bringing biologists to its meeting, and I think there's a long way to go on that. And I think it's a very long-term strategy. It's really about education, so that if we start now, when the current emerging high school people, when they go into universities and they go through the system, 30 years' time when they're running their own labs, it'll be second nature. We won't need to be sitting here talking about will they be aware that their work could be misused. They'll know. They'll be the ones pushing for this. Maybe I'll do myself out of a job in the future.
Paul, did you have thoughts on that, or did you want to put the screws to our friend Piers before other people give them?
No. Actually, we talked about this over lunch too, a little bit earlier, about what really could be done. I do think the question of ethical responsibility, not just with life sciences and biologists and microbiologists and the like, is important, but really in all of science. I mean, anything any of us does, we really have to take into our personal account, is it ethically and morally appropriate to do that? I think the challenge here is, I don't think, ethical scientific courses in ethics and scientific research are really taught regularly in the biological sciences, nor any of the other sciences. And I recall a discussion I had some years ago with one of the directors of the Whitehead Institute at MIT, as some of you may know, and I won't mention his name, but he was giving a presentation on genetic research, and very controversial issue at the time, still is. And I raised the issue with him about the ethical nature of some of their work and to what extent they took that into account. And his immediate response, this is a world-renowned research scientist now, he said, it's not my responsibility. He said, I'm just a scientist, and the ethicists have to decide, what's right and what's wrong. So I can't really judge myself. I just do what's interesting in the lab, and that's the way it goes. And I really took, umbrage at him sort of throwing it off like it's not my problem. What me worry. And I do worry in these issues that a lot of this research could be extremely misused. And maybe the ISU, as we call it, or the BWC, really needs to begin a campaign to encourage ethical standards, sort of a Hippocratic oath, for biologists.
Well, I think it's not even something necessarily the ISU would have to take a lead on. I mean, it is something.
Or the professional societies.
Well, it's firmly there. There was a decision at the second or third review conference, so we're talking 15, 20 years ago, a understanding amongst all member states of the BWC that they would include education and awareness raising as part of life science research.
Right.
That started a process that more recently, in recent years, we've looked at as part of the intersessional processes, and part of the output of that is quite an additional layer of understanding of the sorts of things that might need to go in those modules, different approaches, whether it's codes of conduct, whether it's training courses, whether it's standalone courses, whether it's part of professional responsibility on ongoing training, lifelong learning as a professional society. And there is progress. I mean, it's really good. There is there are a number of people out there who regularly go out and hold these courses. There's quite a large grant from various institutions in the UK, I know, to set up basically to build modules that can be exported for training that. And I think that is a critical building block in moving forward in the future.
Yeah. There also is the accidental use and also the natural appearance, as I've mentioned in my remarks, of biological pathogens, which can and some have been used perhaps as biological weapons in the past. And I think that's why I raised the issue really of disease surveillance and communication. Between the last review conference and the forthcoming one, I know this is being discussed as one of the major issues, but my sense is that there really isn't adequate informative, timely ways to announce the appearance of disease in the world. I posed this to Margaret Chen, the head of the World Health Organization, a while ago, and we discussed this actually in Istanbul at the 12th World Congress of Public Health, where we organized a plenary there a couple of months ago on weapons of mass destruction in public health. And I said, how do you how do you best identify a disease that appears, whether it's flu or equine encephalitis or something? And I said, what's usually the typical way that the World Health Organization finds out about a disease that appears, God knows where, in Vietnam or Southeast Asia or the depths of Africa or someplace? And she says, well, we actually look at newspapers. It's usually newspaper reports that are the first to appear. And I said, is it not a formal notification from the Commissioner of Public Health or the cabinet member? And she said, no, it's usually actually a news account. That's how and I said, this is really so arbitrary and potentially slow. I mean, in these cases, you really want to know immediately. You don't want to wait a week or two, even a couple of days when something like this happens. And I think that's the really disease surveillance issue is an extremely important effort that I think the ISU and the BWC and all the states parties, of course, as well could jump on too. This is not new. I mean, this has been discussed for years and I'm sure has made some progress. But if you talk to WHO representatives, they will tell you that they're way underfunded to really carry out a global disease surveillance coordinated effort. The Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, has been very good here in the United States, helping former Soviet states to build disease surveillance centers and pathogen security procedures and the like. But when I've posed the question to them in the past, at least in the last couple of years, I've said, and if a disease surveillance center is established in, I don't know, let's say Azerbaijan today, if a disease breaks out in Azerbaijan, they have some occurrence in their clinics of a exotic disease suddenly, who reports to whom then? And they said to me at the time, well, they'd report back to the United States, to the Centers for Disease Control or the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. And I said, well, wouldn't you report it to the BWC as well in Geneva, or wouldn't you report it to the World Health Organization? They said, well, no, this is an American program, and we're interested in finding out about it first. So there's, I think there's probably a wide range, not to pick on the Americans, but there's a wide range of opportunity in trying to improve disease surveillance. And I'd be very interested, and there's probably people in the audience much more expert than I am in this, what could be done as well. And I'm sure this arises in the intersessional meetings. And now this year is the disease surveillance discussion too coming. So hopefully we can make some progress in those grounds too.
It's a good opportunity to bring you all into the discussion. We should have microphones, so if you raise your hand, I will call on you, and let me implore you to ask a question and introduce yourself. Jonathan Tucker. I'll do it for you.
Jonathan Tucker, Center for Nonproliferation Studies. Piers, thank you very much for being here and for your presentation. There are historical examples of states that have tried to acquire biological weapons in the past, the former Soviet Union, Iraq, South Africa. And the mechanisms we've talked about so far, such as awareness building or disease surveillance, would not have prevented those states from acquiring or using biological weapons. So the dilemma is, how can we strengthen the treaty in such a way as to verify and enforce compliance? And thus far we seem to be sort of at a loss in doing so. And I just wondered, where do we go from here?
Well, I think that this feeds into the discussion over modern technology. That, if you go even a step further back, it's not just those countries. The US had an offensive program, the UK had an offensive program, and they were huge. We're talking massive scale. I'm not convinced if you wanted to try and achieve the same results today, you would need that scale of research, development and production facilities. The whole concept of modern science is miniaturization, faster processes. Developments in applying engineering concepts to biology are explicitly designed to make it easier and faster to go from concept to application. At that point, the triggers that you might have looked for to prevent a massive scale state program might not be there. And furthermore, I think that the transmission of those capabilities from a very small number of very rich and powerful countries to certainly every state in the world would have the capacity to pursue that sort of program, and possibly then filtering down from there into non-state actors, and depending on where you stand and what you believe, possibly down to individuals for basic capacities. Those triggers, we're looking for smaller and smaller triggers with incredibly reduced lead times. You know, even if you spotted it, if you spotted an early sign in the 60s, you would have probably a decade to worry about before there was a functioning weapon at the end of it. I certainly know if you go back to the days of the Second World War and the UK's first attempts to develop a bomb, it took them years and years and years and years to get a working prototype. And you know, they hadn't even managed to finish it at the end of the war. So you would have had plenty of time to step in. Whether that would be true today is disputable. So I wonder whether that is why I'm looking for alternative approaches that maybe by the time you saw your signs, and if we're honest, managed to motivate the international community to do something about it, maybe whatever you were trying to do has already been wrapped up, finished, and moved somewhere else. You know, it's a tricky one.
Piers, doesn't the Paul? Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I would add that, you know, on the one hand, in your discussion of the ad hoc committee and the 2001 recommendation for substantial verification process, on the one hand, as I said, you have to trust but verify. But I think the other side of the question, you know, Jonathan, very well, you know, as you say, Piers, too, that, you know, there are enormous numbers of facilities that have to be potentially verified. And so in the nuclear sphere, we're talking maybe in the, I don't know, the low thousands, maybe even just the high hundreds, you know, nuclear weapon sites and reprocessing and enrichment facilities and that sort of thing. In the chemical weapons sphere, I know the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons lists about 5,000 potential commercial facilities, including just a handful, as we know, of the existing chemical weapons stockpiles and farmer production facilities. And to date, I know after, 12 years since entry into force, they've inspected probably 1,500 of those 5,000 facilities. So there's a big challenge there. In the biosphere, the bioweapons area, it sounds like we're talking certainly in the tens of thousands and maybe even in the hundreds of thousands of potential sites. So the challenge, I think the challenge of a fully implemented, effective, cost-effective verification system is really a major issue. It brings me back to, and that's I'm sure partly why the United States, you know, avidly opposed the ad hoc committee report in 2001. It brings me back to really how do we globally implement making weapons of this nature, weapons of mass destruction in general, taboo. And I think in the Chemical Weapons Convention sphere, we're really getting very close to that area. We have 7 countries, only 7 countries outstanding outside the Chemical Weapons Convention regime today. Includes a couple which you might put in the hopeless category, you know, like Somalia at this point in time. You know, we've got to have at least a government mechanism in a country to have it sign and ratify and implement the treaty. We have some that are a little more suspicious, like Myanmar and obviously North Korea. And certainly in the latter case, the North Korean case, we expect that they probably have a chemical weapons stockpile. And then you have some countries which you know, fall out of the treaty regime partly due to regional politics: Syria, Egypt, and Israel. Those 3, although Israel has actually signed the treaty. So, you know, you worry without universalizing the Chemical Weapons Convention, you still have potentially rogue countries out there. You know, North Korea has I believe, a strong trade agreement with Myanmar too. So there's the potential of the North Korean stockpile kind of transferring technology or even chemical agents through Myanmar in various ways. But on the other hand, if any one of those countries were to use a chemical weapon, they would be widely condemned, I think, by the world community. And so I think in the case of the BWC, we're close to there too. I mean, we're a couple of dozen countries below, you know, where we should be, I think. But it's very close, I think, to making it absolutely abhorrent for any country to use a biological agent as a weapon?
I think I'd go further. I'd say it was the other way around. Because there is no country, even those outside of the BWC, that openly admits to having biological weapons.
Right.
And my personal opinion on this is I don't think any country could get away with it. And furthermore, even those outside of the treaty regime, and there is a 30-odd list, the majority of them are very small developing nations that are not outside of the regime because of a political decision, but are outside of the regime because they have competing priorities, because they don't have sufficient resources, and they just haven't had their arms twisted hard enough to join.
Yeah.
There are obviously those cases where there is a political decision, and it's the same three: Egypt, Syria, and Israel. And I think all three have made statements, public statements to the BWC, basically committing themselves to the concepts that they find biological weapons abhorrent, but for regional security considerations, they're not going to join the treaty. So I personally don't see a situation where any country could openly say it has biological weapons, and if it was to use them, I can't imagine the international community would let that one slide.
Yeah.
I wanted to refocus in on Jonathan Tucker's question, and then Burgess, I see you've got your hand up. If the situation really is that there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of facilities distributed around the world that are conducting completely legitimate civil applications that are indistinguishable from the facilities that you would use in a biological weapons program, then isn't the implication of that, since we don't want to and can't draw some kind of distinction between good and bad research, isn't the only thing left then an obligation for tremendous affirmative actions on the part of those doing research to provide for transparency, since we can't possibly police?
My personal viewpoint is yes to that question. I mean, I think the responsibility lies with the biologists to make everybody comfortable that what they're doing is for the benefit of humanity. And I think that's part of what it is to be a biologist in this day and age, is to show how it fits into society in a broader way.
Burgess, and then I see we have a hand behind him.
Yes, hi, I'm Burgess Laird with the Institute for Defense Analyses. I have a somewhat narrow question for each of you, somewhat, relatively. Mr. Walker, are you familiar with the notion of Cooperative Threat Reduction 2.0 that's been put out by the National Academy of Sciences? And if so, this global security engagement that entails broadening the spectrum beyond nuclear to other realms, is Global Green backing that? And might there be goodness in Global Green jumping on that and giving it some oomph, if you will? The next question for you, Piers, is quite aside from the question of cost entailed in the numbers of facilities that would need to be inspected under some sort of verification regime, is the question of protection of intellectual property. And I throw this out. Are there any new innovative ideas, if you will, for how under a future verification regime, the intellectual property of a Merck, of a Glaxo, SmithKline could be protected while people are running and going inside of their laboratories and to inspect to see if something nefarious is going on? Thank you.
Two fantastic questions. Paul, do you want to start with Cooperative Threat Reduction 2.0?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, a very, very good and very leading question, Burgess. Thank you for asking that. I am familiar. There's a very good relatively new, came out maybe a month ago, National Academy of Sciences report. I forget the exact title of it, but the nickname of it was CTR 2.0. And it was actually a very, I think, informative and critical look at how we could, in fact, expand cooperative threat reduction. And I actually was fortunately one of the reviewers of the report and was able to I think, add a little bit in the end to the final recommendations and analysis. So yes, I actually fully agree with the recommendations in the report. I wish more people would read it. I wish Congress itself requested the report would pay more attention to it. I wish we could hold some public hearings on it. The report argued essentially that we've done an awful lot in cooperative threat reduction. I've been myself in Global Green and Green Cross, and Gorbachev, our founder and chairman, have been deeply involved in cooperative threat reduction for well over 15, 16 years now. And on the one hand, it's destroyed, helped Russia and other countries like the Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Belarus destroy nuclear warheads. It's blown up missile silos. It's destroyed missiles themselves and rocket propellant and rocket motors. It's provided security on biological pathogens. It's promoted, helped the Russians build the big facility for nerve agent destruction at Chuchi, which in the Kurgan Oblast, which opened, about a month ago, partially opened in quotes, a month ago, and I can talk more about that if you'd like. But the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, not just of the United States, but also within the global partnership, where the Brits and the Canadians and the Germans and and others have actually been very generous, I think, in working with the Russians and the former Soviets. It has all been very limited and very narrow-minded in the sense that all they want to do is destroy weapons. And that's obviously important. We point out that, and the CTR 2.0 report pointed out that, this really involves, though, building rule of law, civil society, community engagement, an ethic of nonproliferation, and a sensitivity to security issues in all of these countries. And the United States program and the global partnership programs on the whole, with some unique examples which sit outside the norm, really haven't paid much attention to that either. So I am very supportive of trying to expand threat reduction, seeing it as more of a seamless web, and building a system whereby these weapon systems are perceived as taboo in many ways. So you can get to Jonathan's problem about the unique person who may try. There'll probably always be that threat, no matter how hard we try. But I think cooperative threat reduction needs to be more heavily funded. The Obama administration has come out and requested in the cooperative threat reduction budget in the fiscal year 2010 defense bill less than was in last year's Bush budget in cooperative threat reduction. And we've worked very closely with both House and Senate Armed Services Committees to increase that amount. You'll see that the House has increased it 30 million, the Senate's increased it 20 million. There's no more money in cooperative threat reduction, hasn't been for 3 years, for working with the Russians in chemical weapons destruction. Very, very short-sighted from my perspective. And we've been able to put a few more million into that pot in the last couple of years. There's 3 million that sits in the draft Senate Armed Services Committee bill. The Russians and Americans have a month ago agreed that we should shut down all public outreach and facilitation of these projects in Russia. And that has actually impacted, I don't want to be too personal about it, but it's impacted our work where we've carried out, we've had 12 public outreach and information offices and programs in Russia for the last decade, trying to facilitate these programs and make sure everybody's on board, and at the same time trying to help the local, very poor communities involved. Russians and Americans have just agreed that also shut down for now, and I think is extremely short-sighted and endangers the long-term nature of these programs at all. So, yeah, I'd urge everyone to take a look at that. It's no doubt on the National Academy website, and read through the recommendations. They're very important, and I hope get much more attention and serious consideration as the Obama administration begins to, get its people in place in the next year.
The National Academies will be very pleased with the product.
They will. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I knew we wanted to work for the elimination of nuclear weapons, but expecting people in Washington to read something, you are an idealist.
I know.
Piers, intellectual property.
I think you've probably identified the exact starting point of if the BWC is going to start thinking about going back down legally binding framework routes. That is the starting point. That's what happened last time. You look at the science and technology. I don't spend enough time dealing with the technical details of that to be able to give you an explicit answer on whether we've moved to the point where that was possible or not. But that's certainly where the process should start, is looking at the science and technology.
Piers,
of...
this is the part where you say there's only 3 of us, we need more money.
Right.
I was getting distracted by the IP thing, which is actually really exciting, because I think it fits into a broader trend in biology in general. Set aside the weapons stuff for a second. There are really big IP issues in biology. The models being discussed are things like the mechanism used to protect software, whether you can have some sort of open source mechanism for biology, where the problem with the current approach perhaps is, in order to protect your intellectual property, you have to go through a very drawn out, very expensive process that means that only the likes of Merck and Pfizer and GSK can afford to really put in place a strong IP regime. There's a lot of work being done, especially in the synthetic biology communities, at looking at alternative models, things like software and the ability to basically put free IP protection in place, more like copyright than product right. That whole IP and biology issue probably would need to be resolved first, and would be a very strong building block to looking at then how you protect those rights in any international regime that may later be developed. But I think that's a really exciting area to be involved with at the minute.
And there was a question behind Burgess. Actually, there are two, so we'll just take them both.
Okay.
Thanks. My name's Kelsey from the Truman National Security Project. And I have a question. You talked about state actors not using chemical or biological weapons. What about non-state actors and the security at those biological facilities where they do have the possibility to make weapons, securing those, and do you know which ones need to build up their security and which ones are secure enough?
Two approaches to come at that question. The first one is to say that non-state actors ultimately are functioning in a state. So first and foremost, that state has an obligation to regulate the control the people that are in it. So the responsibility on stopping that action is part of the obligation that a state has, and all states have that obligation under Security Council Resolution 1540. The second route might be a little bit more controversial. Again, this is definitely personal opinion, but I'm looking forward a few years. I'm looking at the capacity to synthesize biological agents and the dramatic drop in cost and the development of capacity to create viruses, and, if you believe various research institutes, bacteria any day now from scratch, makes you wonder whether, again, it would be the best use of limited resources to focus exclusively on trying to lock down for those facilities. I think we need to broaden our horizons and look at alternative sources for acquiring agents, and let's not forget that they are pretty much all available in nature anyway. There are, of course, additional steps you would have to go through to make it any use, but it's not beyond the possibility of somebody that's been trained to do that.
So we'll take the other question over there, and then we'll come up to the front. Yep, you.
I'm Caroline. I'm also from the Truman Project. I'm just thinking, I mean, after you guys have been talking, it's coming to me that, it's obviously going to be a very abstract, overwhelming, process to verify and, sort of secure however many thousands of, facilities there are. So is the focus going to, should it be more on the response and coordinating response and maybe putting funds, targeted towards that? And do you find that it's difficult to sort of, is it difficult to think of, a very efficient way to deal with response if there hasn't been serious, in terms of non-state actors and so on, occasions where, a large biological threat has, occurred, in which case there's nothing to sort of use as precedence in terms of, figuring out response?
I think I should probably, for the sake of fairness, say that the protocol that was being developed didn't envisage trying to police all of those facilities. They were developing criteria to look at those that were thought to be most at risk of being able to produce those weapons. So, but going past that, the question of response, being here, kind of the real case study would be the response to the anthrax letters. And the incredible strides being made in the US and in other countries in being able to respond to that sort of incident. A lot of lessons learnt, and should it happen again, I think you'd find there'd be a much smoother response, which is a very good sign that the feedback has been working. You have entire, almost brand new areas of science opening up in forensic microbiology and forensic genetics in response to those sorts of incidents. My own country, other developed countries probably have a fairly strong domestic capacity to be able to respond both to the health impact and the investigative impact. The people that would really suffer if there was a more widespread use of these weapons are developing countries, because not only are their public health infrastructures weaker, there might not be an easy mechanism to trigger to get an international response for the public health side, and there's certainly unlikely to be a clean, quick international investigative response already existing. I mean, that clearly is one of the areas that is, in my opinion, lacking in the current regime, is something that a developed country could call upon if they needed it domestically. You know, we're not even moving into the realms of one country wanting to investigate another country. What if country X in Africa had a suspicious outbreak? It doesn't have its own domestic capacity to investigate it. What do? They have no choice but to go to a developed country and to ask them to come and help them. Certainly I've heard the opinion expressed that it might be nice if there was some sort of capacity out there that they could go to and say, hey, we need some help here, please.
Paul, did you want to say a few things before we took the...
Yeah, I would add, it brings me back to the need for universality. You know, if we want to develop a global norm against all use of any of these biological pathogens or chemical agents or anything else, you need every country on board the treaty. You know, if there's one country that's outstanding, even if it's, you know, a country without an existing government like Somalia, or in the chemical weapons case, we have Angola hanging out there too, and at least this conversation's going on, but recently it was the Bahamas and the Dominican Republic, actually, that hadn't signed on board the Chemical Weapons Convention. It's just a matter of being a little proactive and trying to help them.
If we need a special envoy for the Bahamas...
Hey, yeah, exactly. We're all volunteering for it, right? So I think it's universality. I mean, that's a major issue, and I've been, you know, somewhat frustrated, I guess, by the lack of proactive outreach by some of the major players in the conventions. You know, why the United States could very easily go around the world having specific meetings on what it takes to get, for example, Angola on board the Chemical Weapons Convention. You know, that fortunately has also been a responsibility of the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. So the Director General there, Ambassador Rogelio Fiat, we had here in town a couple weeks ago, Argentinian diplomat, has increasingly been active on that. The problem with the BWC is we only have 3 people and a budget, you know, below most NGO budgets here in Washington, D.C. So they really don't have the time and the, you know, and the money to do that. They, you know, as Piers tells me, they have $10,000 travel budget per year, you know, for all 3 of them. You know, and all of us probably who do a lot of this work have a lot more than that in our travel budgets, even here. It also brings you to the question of national implementation, criminalizing all of this and developing national legislation. So as you say, Piers, the country itself is responsible for the single actor or the terrorist or whoever it might be that may do this. On the other hand, when you look back in the 1990s at the Japanese Aum Shinrikyo group, which was a small, you know, terrorist Japanese organization, they were actually, you know, pretty effective given their limited abilities back then in trying to work with anthrax and then developing sarin, and then in fact releasing sarin, you know, in the Tokyo subway, which killed a dozen or more people and injured thousands in the Tokyo subway. So some of this stuff can be probably done small home basement laboratories, you know, in bathtubs, and if you have enough protective gear to do it. And I think the anthrax attack in, you know, 2001 also indicates that probably very small groups of people with the right expertise could do it. And I don't think there's really anything we could do that would fully, you know, guarantee against that. I would also add we need strong surveillance, That has to be better coordinated globally. We need good response mechanisms, and maybe some of that expertise should sit with the BWC, which it doesn't right now. So who do you call? I don't know, HHS, or CDC or something like that. I suppose the WHO, I guess. We need better declarations. One of the challenges in trying to oversee the chemical industry facilities is that the industry is gradually learning how to make their declarations. But they're required under the Chemical Weapons Convention to actually declare what work they do every year in a very basic declaration, a few pages that goes to the Hague. And that's been very difficult to implement so far. There's confusion about it. The declarations are inadequate. Half the industry doesn't even make them out. So if you had adequate declarations of biolabs or adequate declarations, in this case, of chemical laboratories and industry, you can in fact triage it. Of course, there's a bit of trust that's involved there too. And the last point I would make is we might consider, this is probably fairly controversial, but we might consider building a challenge inspection mechanism within the biological control regime. We have that in the chemical weapons regime. It's never been used, but if any country, any state party is suspicious of someone else doing something, and the Americans have been suspicious about the Russians and the Chinese and maybe the Iranians and a few others over the years, you can go and make a formal, official government challenge inspection. And that then goes immediately, within hours, to the Executive Council and the inspector. It has to be within that country within 48 hours, if I'm not mistaken. And there's all sorts of negotiations which have gone on about what equipment you can bring in and points of entry and how much you can do. It's a very complicated process, but it has to be done very efficiently and in a timely way. That could maybe exist under the BWC too, and I don't know if something suspicious arose in a country, you'd need some sort of an inspectorate then to undertake that, and that inspectorate, of course, would require some training, which would mean expanding the ISU, maybe even calling it a secretariat, I don't know, in Geneva. But yeah, there are a lot of possibilities, I think, for addressing some of that. But it would never, obviously, it'll never be perfect globally at all.
We have only about 10 minutes left, and we have 3 questions. The gentleman with the blue tie has been very patient, and then we'll work our way back. Wow. But you will get called on. But yeah, this fellow right here with the yellow shirt and blue tie.
Hi, I'm Will Pienard from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and a lot of times, whenever biological weapons talk comes up, education is always pushed as something that needs to be done, whether it be for researchers, for the medical community, public health. And my question is, how is it when these programs are already so jammed-packed with information, can you implement putting ethics, putting diagnosis, treatment, and response, and all these added things into the program when there's really no time already within their structured programs?
Great question. Piers?
Short answer. That's not about biological weapons. I mean, modern biologists have to deal with a whole raft of moral and ethical issues, whether it's stem cell research, whether it's human testing, security aspects. They're all in there. That's what needs to go into the course, something that deals with everything, and I think that's only the first step. I mean, it's basically there so that everybody has access to that information. The one that I personally think will make a much larger difference is when you get into professional lifelong learning. I still have my affiliation with the Institute of Biology in the UK. In order to keep my chartered status, I have to, every time I renew my subscription, fill in a form that says how I have demonstrated an awareness of ethical issues in the last year. That makes me stop and think about how I've done it, and it certainly means that as I go through the year, I'm looking for things I can put in that form at the end of it. I mean, it's a fantastic opportunity.
I'm blinded by the lights, but Jerry Epstein? And then the last question will be the gentleman sitting behind the redoubtable Greg Thielman.
Jerry Epstein. I'm always a little surprised in these discussions nowadays to have things keep coming back to verification. It seems to me that, Piers, you made a very elegant set of statements which I think are hard to get around. But even setting aside the more like hundreds of thousands rather than thousands of facilities, my problem with a kind of an inspection regime is what can you do at one of them? If you had one facility, these things are so inherently ambiguous that we're bringing models from the 1950s where we have warehouses full of spray tanks and we just need to go find them, or we have some unique weaponization. But that's not where this technology is going, even if it's to be maliciously applied. So my problem with a verification protocol, and I guess I'm asking for a response to this, is not that it's not terribly effective. A 30% regime would be fine for me. A negative 30% regime is not. Now, we're just as likely to indict people who are innocent as to miss people who are guilty. I don't see any set of tools or techniques that actually tells you anything useful, given this, about separating malign from innocent in most cases. And maybe there's the egregious one you could trip across. So setting aside the practicalities and the costs, I'd like your reaction. Isn't the inherent nature of what you would need to do malign work with this technology so inherently ambiguous as to make any notion of an inspection regime not only imperfect, but just as likely to be worse than nothing than to be better than nothing?
So, false positives. Piers and then Paul.
I think the thing in here is what you're aiming to accomplish. I can see a structure like the things that have been talked about playing a very critical role in making countries, people, civil society more comfortable that we know what's going on in facilities. Not that you're going to walk into a warehouse and find spray tanks, but that actually you just happen to know which facilities in your country happen to be dealing with influenza or SARS, or where the agents are. And the fact that a country knows that builds trust amongst other countries and amongst other civilians that they're on top of this issue. And I think that still has a role to play. I suspect I'm dodging the question slightly,
But that's what the reception will be for.
Right.
Paul?
Right. We can all think about this. No, I mean, I would only add, Jerry, I understand it's a challenging, it would be a challenging inspection regime, but the regime we know well, which is the Chemical Weapons Convention Inspectorate, which has close to 200 inspectors, which does two main tasks. One is being on site at chemical weapons destruction facilities and former production facilities which are being destroyed, dismantled, and converted, and also does chemical industry inspections. That has actually gone very well, and they've developed their different protocols and equipment and everything else they need to identify. There are some national differences about taking samples out of the country and that sort of thing, and bringing samples back to The Hague. But the inspectorate has actually worked very well, and I think there's a pretty high level of confidence when they go to a chemical industry. It's not just looking at the tanks, but it's looking at the books and meeting with a variety of the different managers and the like. It's really a pretty good process, and I think, I'm told, has worked very well and with a pretty high level of confidence. I think that could be, maybe I'm a little bit naive in it all, but I think that could probably be worked out for the BWC if people really wanted to do that. It may be that they just wanted to inspect, labs and commercial facilities that deal with, highly infectious disease, BSL 3 and 4 level labs. I mean, that would be an option too. I know the Americans and the Russians would be probably very, very concerned about giving access to foreign inspectors in those labs, but it could very well be that you could develop a delimited number of labs and facilities that you really want to inspect on a regular basis and keep strong oversight on. And maybe that would bring it down to a few hundred versus tens of thousands.
Let's take the last question.
Samar Chatterjee from Safe Foundation. I have a little different take on this. Like you said that the scientists could be given ethical training. Now, they've been given, nuclear weapons were developed by even scientists who had those ethical training, but for them, it was pretty sacred that they were developing a nuclear weapon so that it can be dropped in either Germany or Japan, So I guess those ethics don't work very well. And I think you pointed out that there was a scientist who said, well, he doesn't care so long if somebody from CIA shows up and says, you've got $5 million. Can you work on this problem? He said, and most of the time you don't find things looking for a bad thing. Sometimes you find in research some bad stuff while looking for a good thing you're looking for. So it's very hard with ethics or this kind of thing. And if a government really wants something developed, even if they have signed a treaty or convention, they can put it underground and you'd never find it. So therefore, in my opinion, First thing is for the big guys like the United States, Russia, China, or those who, or even India if it holds chemical weapons, to come out clean and say, we've got rid of it. Now you guys don't do it. Maybe that more moral, because Mr. Obama is saying we want to get rid of nuclear weapons. Maybe that kind of moral might sway. But still, a scientist working for the Taliban would consider it a sacred duty probably to develop a chemical weapon which they can drop it at the United States. So given that, I don't see all this discussion leading to anywhere other than giving ideas to some people that they should be developing it.
All right. Well, on that happy note, would either of you gentlemen like to offer some closing thoughts?
Yeah. I see three issues in there. The first one, value of education on ethics. Compare and contrast two stories. The first one is Ken Alibek in his book Biohazard, whether you dispute it or not. One thing he comes across saying very clearly is about his recruitment process into the Russian BW program was, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to do it. Nobody told me I wasn't trained. I didn't know the convention existed. There were no national laws that I knew about. I was just told I was being a loyal citizen. Compare that in a situation without the training to the situation which Seymour Hersh reports in his 60s look at chemical and biological weapons, the contemporary when the US still had an offensive program that was completely legal, completely permitted, and pretty much open, where he reports, wait a minute, during the 50s, as part of that program, the US couldn't recruit doctors. Not because it was illegal, because it wasn't. Not because they didn't have resources, because they did. The only stumbling block was the Hippocratic Oath. Not a legally binding commitment, but purely a personal, moral, ethical decision that they weren't prepared to set aside the do no harm principle to take part in an offensive weapons program. So I would say there is very strong evidence that that does work. Second, all right, so if an intelligence agency tipped up with $5 million and said to a research scientist, I've got a project for you, come and work on this, they're effectively having to suspend their professional career to do it. Modern science, publish or die. If you're working for the CIA you mentioned or any other intelligence agency doing confidential, restricted work, you can't publish on it. No papers, no career. Finally, if you're a country, you can bury it underground. Well, that's why we want to know what countries are doing. And you could raise serious questions about a country that creates a concrete, steel-reinforced concrete bunker half a mile underground to do vaccine production. I mean, those are exactly the sorts of triggers that could lead to existing processes like the UN Security Council, the Secretary General, or other processes saying, hey, wait a minute, these are triggers that we can see. This is not this is the smoking gun scenario. You know, if we have a mechanism where public research, beneficial research is known about and available, the holes in what we don't know will automatically trigger concern.
Paul?
That's really a good summary, Piers. I kind of add too much to that. I would just say, there are three very important 5-year reviews coming up of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2010, the Biological Weapons Convention in 2011, the Chemical Weapons Convention in 2012. And I would urge people to pay attention to that and demand, in fact, that the Obama administration, take those reviews extremely seriously and figure out how we can best improve and implement and universalize those treaties. And I guess lastly, I would emphasize the importance of cooperative threat reduction funding and non-proliferation funding through in the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Fund, whether it's State Department, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense, where those programs have all been really grossly underfunded. We've committed a lot of money, relative-wise, to all other countries, but remain relatively underfunded. The United States is no longer really actively participating in chemical weapons destruction in Russia, nor in actually bioweapons issues to a great extent in Russia. So those are really critical issues, and I really hope it partly obviously depends on our counterparts in Russia and the former Soviet Union as well. We can't just jump in and do something if they don't bless it, with us. But that's very important. And I guess I'd add one related point is the United States has actually, to a large extent, underfunded international organizations, including these arms control regimes we're talking about, IAEA, CTBTO, BWC, and OPCW and others over the years. And if you read Hillary Clinton's testimony when she was nominated as Secretary of State, she said, I realize that we're somewhere over $1 billion in arrears in supporting international organizations. And I hope that in the next few years we can make that up. It's a real challenge. Those of us who work with these international multilateral arms control regimes realize that oftentimes the U.S. money comes, but it arrives in Vienna or Geneva or The Hague, 6 to 12 months late, in which case it can't even be obligated. And the U.S. dues and assessments are 20 or 25% of the budgets of these organizations. So if we want the BWC and the OPCW and other organizations to really be effective, we've actually got to get the State Department to seriously fund their dues, assessments, and voluntary contributions. And I think the Obama administration is actually very committed to that, whereas the Bush administration was not. So I'll leave that as a final, simple implementation measure.
All right. Well, in just a moment, we will adjourn to the wine reception in the back. There's a little bit of cheese. Some of it's even Swiss, in case you feel homesick.
Wow.
But join me in thanking Piers Millett from the Biological Weapons Convention Implementation Support Unit, Paul Walker from Global Green USA, Jill Perillo from Physicians for Social Responsibility, and the staff of the New America Foundation.
Thank you.